Tartars believe in God as the creator of the universe and as the rewarder and avenger of all, but they also worship the sun, moon, fire, earth, and water, and idols made in felt, like human beings. They have little toleration and put Michael of Turnigu and Fedor to death for not worshipping the sun at midday at the command of Prince Bathi. They are superstitious people, believing in enchantment and sorcery and looking upon fire as the purifier of all things. When one of their chiefs dies, he is buried with a horse saddled and bridled, a table, a dish of meat, a cup of mare's milk, and a mare and foal. Tartars are most obedient to their chiefs and are truthful and not quarrelsome. Murders and deeds of violence are rare. There is very little robbery, and articles of value are never guarded. They bear great fatigue and hunger without complaint, as well as heat and cold, singing and dancing under the most adverse circumstances. They are much prone to drink to excess. They are very proud and disdainful to strangers, and have no respect for the lives of human beings. Carpini completes his sketch of the Tartar character by adding that they eat all kinds of animals, dogs, wolves, foxes, horses, and even sometimes their fellow creatures. Their principal beverage is the milk of the mare, sheep, goat, cow, and camel. They have neither wine, cervisia, a beverage composed of grain and herbs, nor mead, but only intoxicating liquors. They are very dirty in their habits, scarcely ever washing their porringers, or only doing so in their broth. They hardly ever wash their clothes, more especially when there is thunder about, and they eat rats, mice, and see if they are badly off for other food. The men are not brought up to any manual labor, their whole occupation consisting in hunting, shooting with bow and arrows, watching the flocks, and riding. The women and girls are very athletic and very brave. They prepare furs and make clothes, drive carts and camels, and as polygamy is practiced among them, and a man buys as many wives as he can keep, there are enough women for all these employments. Such is the resume of Carpini's observations made during his residence at Siroorda while he was awaiting the emperor's election. Soon, he found that the election was about to take place. He noticed that the courtiers always sang before Cunius when he came out of his tent, and bowed down before him with beautiful little wands in their hands, having small pieces of scarlet wool attached to them. On a plain about 4 leagues from Siroorda, beside a stream, a tent was prepared for the coronation, carpeted with scarlet, and supported on columns covered with gold. On St. Bartholomew's Day a large concourse of people assembled. Each one fell on his knees as he arrived, and remained praying towards the sun. But Carpini and his companion refused to join in this idolatrous worship of the sun. Then Cunius was placed on the imperial throne, and the dukes, and all the assembled multitudes having done homage to him, he was consecrated. As soon as this ceremony was over, Carpini and Stephen were commanded to appear before the emperor. They were first searched, and then entered the imperial presence at the same time as other ambassadors, the bearers of rich presents. The poor papal envoys had nothing to present. Whether this had anything to do with the length of time they had to wait before His Imperial Majesty could attend to their affairs, we do not know, but days passed slowly by, and they were nearly dying of hunger and thirst, before they received a summons to appear before the secretary of the emperor, and letters to the Pope were given to them, ending with these words: "We worship God, and by His help we shall destroy the whole earth from east to west." The envoys had now nothing to wait for, and during the whole of the winter they traveled across icy deserts. About May they again arrived at the court of Prince Bathi, who gave them free passes, and they reached Kiev about the middle of June, 1247. On the 9th of October of the same year, the Pope made Carpini Bishop of Antivari in Dalmatia, and this celebrated traveler died at Rome about the year 1251. Carpini's mission was not of much use, and the Tartars remained much as they were before, a savage and ferocious tribe. But 6 years after his return, another monk of the minor order of Franciscans, named William Rubruquis, of Belgian origin, was sent to the barbarians who lived in the country between the Volga and the Don. The object of this journey was as follows. St. Louis was waging war against the Saracens of Syria at this time, and while he was engaging the infidels, Erkelty, a Mongol prince, attacked them on the side nearest to Persia, and thus caused a diversion that was in favor of the King of France. The report arose that Prince Erkelty had become a Christian, and St. Louis, anxious to prove the truth of it, charged Rubruquis to go into the prince's own country and there make what observations he could upon the subject. In the month of June 1253, Rubruquis and his companions embarked for Constantinople. From thence they reached the mouth of the river Don on the Sea of Azov, where they found a great number of Goths. On their arrival among the Tartars, their reception was at first very inhospitable, but after presenting the letters with which they were furnished, Zagathal, the governor of that province, gave them wagons, horses, and oxen for their journey. Thus equipped they set out, and were much surprised next day by meeting a moving village. That is to say, all the huts were placed on wagons and were being moved away. During the 10 days that Rubruquis and his companions were passing through this part of the country, they were very badly treated, and had it not been for their own store of biscuits, they must have died of starvation. After passing by the end of the Sea of Azov, they went in an easterly direction and crossed a sandy desert on which neither tree nor stone was visible. This was the country of the Comans that Carpini had traversed, but in a more northerly part. Rubruquis left the mountains inhabited by the Circassians to the south, and after a wearisome journey of 2 months, arrived at the camp of Prince Sartach on the banks of the Volga. This was the court of the prince, the son of Batu Khan. He had 6 wives, each of whom possessed a palace of her own, some houses, and a great number of chariots, some of them very large, being drawn by a team of 22 oxen harnessed in pairs. Sartach received the envoys of the King of France very graciously, and seeing their poverty, he supplied them with all that they required. They were to be presented to the prince in their sacerdotal dress, when bearing on a cushion a splendid Bible, the gift of the King of France, a psalter given by the Queen, a missal, a crucifix, and a censer, they entered the royal presence, taking good care not to touch the threshold of the door, which would have been considered profanation. Once in the royal presence, they sang the Salve Regina. After the prince and those of the princesses who were present at the ceremony had examined the books, and see that the monks had brought with them, the envoys were allowed to retire, it being impossible for Rubruquis to form any opinion as to Sartach's being a Christian or not. But his work was not yet finished, the prince having pressed the envoys to go to his father's court. Rubruquis complied with the request, and crossing the country lying between the Volga and the Don, they arrived at their destination. There the same ceremonies had to be gone through as at the court of Prince Sartach. The monks had to prepare their books and see and be presented to the Khan, who was seated on a large gilded throne, but not wishing to treat with the envoys himself, he sent them to Karakorum, to the court of Mangu Khan. They crossed the country of the Bashkirs and visited Kenchet, Talach, passed the Aksirts and reached Iquiuz, a town of which the position cannot be accurately ascertained in the present day. Then by the land of Organum, by the lake of Balkhesh, and the territory of the Uyghurs, they arrived at Karakorum, the capital of the Mongolian Empire, where Carpini had stopped without entering the town. This town, says Rubruquis, was surrounded with walls of earth and had 4 gates in the walls. The principal buildings it contained were 2 mosques and a Christian church. While in this city, the monk made many interesting observations on the surrounding people, especially upon the Tangurs, whose oxen, of a remarkable race, are no other than the yaks, so celebrated in Thibet. In speaking of the Thibetans, he notices their most extraordinary custom of eating the bodies of their fathers and mothers, in order to secure their having an honorable sepulture. When Rubruquis and his companions reached Karakorum, they found that the great Khan was not in his capital, but in one of his palaces, which was situated on the further side of the mountains, which rise in the northern part of the country. They followed him there, and the next day after their arrival presented themselves before him with bare feet, according to the Franciscan custom, so securing for themselves frozen toes. Rubruquis thus describes the interview: Mangu Khan is a man of middle height with a flat nose. He was lying on a couch clad in a robe of bright fur, which was speckled like the skin of a sea calf. He was surrounded with falcons and other birds. Several kinds of beverages, arak punch, fermented mare's milk, and bol, a kind of mead, were offered to the envoys, but they refused them all. The Khan, less prudent than they, soon became intoxicated on these drinks, and the audience had to be ended without any result being arrived at. Rubruquis remained several days at Mangu Khan's court. He found there a great number of German and French prisoners, mostly employed in making different kinds of arms or in working the mines of Baikal. The prisoners were well treated by the Tartars and did not complain of their lot. After several interviews with the great Khan, Rubruquis gained permission to leave, and he returned to Karakoram. Near this town stood a magnificent palace belonging to the Khan. It was like a large church with nave and double aisles. Here the sovereign sits at the northern end on a raised platform, the gentleman being seated on his right and the ladies on his left hand. It is at this palace that twice every year splendid fetes are given, when all the nobles of the country are assembled round their sovereign. While at Karakoram, Rubruquis collected many interesting documents relating to the Chinese, their customs, literature, and sea. Then, leaving the capital of the Mongols, he returned by the same route as he had come, as far as Astrakhan. But there he branched to the south and went to Syria with a Turkish escort, which was rendered necessary by the presence of tribes bent on pillage. He visited Derbend and went thence by Nakhchivan, Erzurum, Sivas, Caesarea, and Iconium to the port of Kerch, whence he embarked for his own country. His route was much the same as that of Carpini, but his narrative is less interesting, and the Belgian does not seem to have been gifted with the spirit of observation which characterized the Italian monk. With Carpini and Rubruquis closes the list of celebrated travelers of the 13th century, but we have the brilliant career of Marco Polo now before us, whose travels extended over part of the 13th and 14th centuries. Chapter 4. Marco Polo, 1253–1324. 1. The interest of the Genoese and Venetian merchants in encouraging the exploration of Central Asia, the family of Polo, and its position in Venice. Nicholas and Matteo Polo, the two brothers, they go from Constantinople to the court of the Emperor of China. Their reception at the court of Kublai Khan, the emperor appoints them his ambassadors to the Pope. Their return to Venice. Marco Polo, he leaves his father Nicholas and his uncle Matteo for the residence of the King of Tartary, the new Pope Gregory X. The narrative of Marco Polo is written in French from his dictation by Rusticien of Pisa. The Genoese and Venetian merchants could not fail to be much interested in the explorations of the brave travelers in Central Asia, India, and China, for they saw that these countries would give them new openings for disposing of their merchandise, and also the great benefit to be derived by the West from being supplied with the productions of the East. The interests of commerce stimulated fresh explorations, and it was this motive that actuated two noble Venetians to leave their homes and brave all the fatigue and danger of a perilous journey. These two Venetians belonged to the family of Polo, which had come originally from Dalmatia, and, owing to successful trading, had become so opulent as to be reckoned among the patrician families of Venice. In 1260, the two brothers, Nicholas and Matteo, who had lived for some years in Constantinople, where they had established a branch house, went to the Crimea with a considerable stock of precious stones, where their eldest brother, Andrea Polo, had his place of business. Thence, taking a northeasterly direction and crossing the country of the Comans, they reached the camp of Barkai Khan on the Volga. This Mongol prince received the two merchants very kindly and bought all the jewels they offered him at double their value. Niccolo and Matteo remained a year in the Mongolian camp, but a war breaking out at this time between Barkai and Hulagu, the conqueror of Persia, the two brothers, not wishing to be in the midst of a country where war was being waged, went to Bokhara, and there they remained 3 years. But when Barkai was vanquished and his capital taken, the partisans of Hulagu induced the two Venetians to follow them to the residence of the Grand Khan of Tartary, who was sure to give them a hearty welcome. This Kublai Khan, the fourth son of Genghis Khan, was emperor of China and was then at his summer palace in Mongolia on the frontier of the Chinese Empire. The Venetian merchants set out and were a whole year crossing the immense extent of country lying between Bokhara and the northern limits of China. Kublai Khan was much pleased to receive these strangers from the distant west. He feted them and asked, with much eagerness, for any information that they could give him of what was happening in Europe, requiring details of the government of the various kings and emperors and their methods of making war, and he then conversed at some length about the Pope and the state of the Latin Church. Matteo and Niccolo fortunately spoke the Tartar language fluently, so they could freely answer all the emperor's questions. Kublai Khan's feast on the arrival of the Venetian merchants. Kublai Khan's feast on the arrival of the Venetian merchants. It had occurred to Kublai Khan to send messengers to the Pope, and he seized the opportunity to beg the two brothers to act as his ambassadors to His Holiness. The merchants thankfully accepted his proposal, for they foresaw that this new character would be very advantageous to them. The emperor had some charters drawn up in the Turkish language, asking the Pope to send 100 learned men to convert his people to Christianity. Then he appointed one of his barons named Kargatl to accompany them, and he charged them to bring him some oil from the sacred lamp, which is perpetually burning before the tomb of Christ at Jerusalem. The two brothers took leave of the Khan, having been furnished with passports by him, which put both men and horses at their disposal throughout the empire, and in 1266 they set out on their journey. Soon the Baron Kargatl fell ill, and the Venetians were obliged to leave him and continue their journey. But in spite of all the aid that had been given to them, they were 3 years in reaching the port of Laias in Armenia, now known by the name of Issus. Leaving this port, they arrived at Acre in 1269, where they heard of the death of Pope Clement Roman IV, to whom they were sent, but the legate Theobald lived in Acre and received the Venetians. Learning what was the object of their mission, he begged them to wait for the election of the new pope. The brothers had been absent from their country for 15 years, so they resolved to return to Venice, and at Negropont they embarked on board a vessel that was going direct to their native town. On landing there, Niccolo was met by news of the death of his wife and of the birth of his son, who had been born shortly after his departure in 1254. This son was the celebrated Marco Polo. The two brothers waited at Venice for the election of the Pope, but at the end of 2 years, as it had not taken place, they thought they could no longer defer their return to the Emperor of the Mongols. Accordingly, they started for Acre, taking Marco Polo with them, who could not then have been more than 17. At Acre they had an interview with the legate Theobald, who authorized them to go to Jerusalem and there to procure some of the sacred oil. This mission accomplished, the Venetians returned to Acre and asked the legate to give them letters to Kublai Khan, mentioning the death of Pope Clement Roman IV. He complied with their request, and they returned to Laias or Issus. There, to their great joy, they learnt that the legate Theobald had just been made pope with the title of Gregory X on the 1st of September, 1271. The newly elected pope sent at once for the Venetian envoys, and the king of Armenia placed a galley at their disposal to expedite their return to Acre. The pope received them with much affection and gave them letters to the Emperor of China. He added 2 preaching friars, Nicholas of Vicenza and William of Tripoli, to their party and gave them his blessing on their departure. They went back to Laias, but had scarcely arrived before they were made prisoners by the soldiers of the Mameluke Sultan Bibars, who was then ravaging Armenia. The 2 preaching friars were so discouraged at this outset of the expedition that they gave up all idea of going to China and left the 2 Venetians and Marco Polo to prosecute the journey together as best they could. Marco Polo. Marco Polo. Here begins what may properly be called Marco Polo's travels. It is a question if he really visited all the places that he describes, and it seems probable that he did not. In fact, in the narrative written at his dictation by Rusticien of Pisa, it is stated, Marco Polo, a wise and noble citizen of Venice, saw nearly all herein described with his own eyes, and what he did not see he learnt from the lips of truthful and credible witnesses. But we must add that the greater part of the kingdoms and towns spoken of by Marco Polo he certainly did visit. We will follow the route he describes, simply pointing out what the traveler learnt by hearsay during the important missions with which he was charged by Kublai Khan. During this second journey, the travelers did not follow exactly the same road as on the first occasion of their visit to the Emperor of China. They had lengthened their route by passing to the north of the Celestial Mountains, but now they turned to the south of them, and though this route was shorter than the other, they were 3 years and a half in accomplishing their journey, being much impeded by the rains and the difficulty of crossing the great rivers. Their course may be easily followed with the help of a map of Asia, as we have substituted the modern names in place of the ancient ones used by Marco Polo in his narrative. Chapter 2. Marco Polo. Armenia Minor, Armenia, Mount Ararat, Georgia, Mosul, Baghdad, Basra, Taurus, Persia, the province of Kirman, Komadi, Ormuz, the old man of the mountain, Cheburgan, Balkh, Kashmir, Kashgar, Samarkand, Cotton, the desert, Tangun, Karakoram, Signanfu, the Great Wall, Changtu, the residence of Kublai Khan, Kambaluk, now Pekin, the emperor's fetes, his hunting, description of Pekin, Chinese mint and banknotes, the system of posts in the empire. Marco Polo left the town of Issus. He describes Armenia Minor as a very unhealthy place, the inhabitants of which, though once valiant, are now cowardly and wretched, their only talent seeming to lie in their capacity for drinking to excess. From Armenia Minor, he went to Turkomania, whose inhabitants, though somewhat of savages, are clever in cultivating pastures and breeding horses and mules, and the townspeople excel in the manufacture of carpets and silk. Armenia proper, that Marco Polo next visited, affords a good camping ground to the Tartar armies during the summer. There the traveler saw Mount Ararat, where Noah's Ark rested after the deluge. He noticed that the lands bordering on the Caspian Sea afford large supplies of naphtha, which forms an important item in the trade of that neighborhood. When he left Armenia, he took a northeasterly course towards Georgia, a kingdom lying on the south side of the Caucasus, whose ancient kings, says the legend, were born with an eagle traced on their right shoulders. The Georgians he describes as good archers and men of war, and also as clever in working in gold and manufacturing silk. Here is a celebrated defile, 4 leagues in length, which lies between the Caucasus and the Caspian Sea, that the Turks call the Iron Door, and Europeans the Pass of Derbend, and here too is the miraculous lake, where fish are said to exist only during Lent. Hence the travelers descended towards the kingdom of Mosul, and arrived at the town of the same name on the right bank of the Tigris, thence going to Baghdad, the residence of the Caliph of all the Saracens. Marco Polo gives an account of the taking of Baghdad by the Tartars in 1255, mentioning a wonderful story in support of the Christian idea of faith that can remove mountains. He points out the route from this town to the Persian Gulf, which may be reached in 18 days by the river, passing Basra, the country of dates. From this point to Taurus, a Persian town in the province of Azerbaijan, Marco Polo's route seems to be doubtful. He takes up his narrative at Taurus, which he describes as a large flourishing town built in the midst of beautiful gardens and carrying on a great traffic in precious stones and other valuable merchandise. But its Saracen inhabitants are disloyal and treacherous. Here he seems to divide Persia geographically into 8 provinces. The natives of Persia, according to him, are formidable enemies to the merchants, who are obliged to travel armed with bows and arrows. The principal trade of the country seems to be in horses and asses, which are sent to Kis or Ormuz and thence to India. The natural productions of the country are wheat, barley, millet, and grapes, which grow in abundance. Marco Polo went next to Yezd, the most easterly town of Persia proper. On leaving it, after a ride of 7 days through magnificent forests abounding in game, he came to the province of Kirman. Here the mines yield large quantities of turquoise, as well as iron and antimony, the manufacture of arms and harness, as well as embroidery, and the training of falcons for hunting, occupy a great number of the inhabitants. On leaving Kirman, Marco Polo and his 2 companions set out on a 9 days journey across a rich and populous country to the town of Komadi, which is supposed to be the Memnon of the present day, and was even then sinking into decay. The country was superb. On all sides were to be seen fine fat sheep, great oxen, white as snow, with short strong horns, and thousands of domestic fowls and other birds. Also there were magnificent date, orange, and pistachio trees. After traveling for 5 days, they entered the beautiful and well-watered plain of Kormos or Ormuz, and after 2 days' further march, they reached the shores of the Persian Gulf and the town of Ormuz, which forms the seaport of the kingdom of Kirman. This country they found very warm and unhealthy, but rich in date and spice trees, in grain, precious stones, silk and golden stuffs, and elephants' tusks, wine made from the date and other merchandise being brought into the town ready for shipment on board ships with but one mast, which came in numbers to the port. But many were lost on the voyage to India, as they were only built with wooden pegs, not iron nails, to fasten them together. From Ormuz, Marco Polo, going up again towards the northeast, visited Kirman. Then he ventured by dangerous roads across a sandy desert, where there was only brackish water to be found, the desert across which, 1,500 years before, Alexander had led his army to meet Nearchus. 7 days afterwards, he entered the town of Kabis. On leaving this town, he crossed for 8 days the Great Plains to Tanakan, the capital of the province of Cumes, probably Damagan. At this point of his narrative, Marco Polo gives an account of the old man of the mountain, the chief of the Mahometan sect called the Hashishins, who were noted for their religious fanaticism and terrible cruelty. He next visited the Khorasan town of Cheburgan, a city celebrated for its sweet melons, and then the noble city of Balkh, situated near the source of the Oxus. Next he crossed a country infested by lions to Taken, a great salt market frequented by a large number of merchants, and to Skasum. This town seems to be the Kashim spoken of by Marston, the Kishan or Krishan of Hiawansang, which Sir Henry Rawlinson has identified with the hill of Kharazm of Zendavesta that some commentators think must be the modern Kunduz. In this part of the country, he says porcupines abound, and when they are hunted they curl themselves up, darting out the prickles on their sides and backs at the dogs that are hunting them. We now know how much faith to put in this pretended power of defense said to be possessed by the porcupine. Marco Polo now entered the rocky mountainous kingdom of the Balkhs, whose kings claimed descent from Alexander the Great, a cold country producing good fast horses, excellent falcons, and all kinds of game. Here, too, are prolific ruby mines worked by the king and which yield large quantities, but they are so strictly enclosed that no one on pain of death may set foot on the Cyanan mountain containing the mines. In other places silver is found, and many precious stones, of which he says, they make the finest azure in the world, meaning lapis lazuli. His stay in this part of the country must have been a long one to have enabled him to observe so many of its characteristics. 10 days' journey from hence, he entered a province which must be the Peshawar of the present day, whose dark-skinned inhabitants were idolaters. Then after 7 days' further march, about midday, he came to the kingdom of Kashmir, where the temperature is cool, and towns and villages are very numerous. Had Marco Polo continued his route in the same direction, he would soon have reached the territory of India, but instead of that he took a northerly course, and in 12 days was in Vakan, a land watered by the upper Oxus, which runs through splendid pastures, where feed immense flocks of wild sheep called muflons. Thence he went through a mountainous country, lying between the Altai and Himalayan ranges to Kashgar. Here Marco Polo's route is the same as that of his uncle and his father during their first voyage, when from Bokhara they were taken to the residence of the great Khan. From Kashgar, Marco Polo diverged a little to the west, to Samarkand, a large town inhabited by Saracens and Christians, then to Yarkand, a city frequented by caravans trading between India and northern Asia, passing by Khatan, the capital of the province of that name, and by Pain, a town whose situation is uncertain, but in a part of the country where chalcedony and jasper abound. He came to the kingdom of Karachar, which extends along the borders of the desert of Job. Then after 5 days further traveling over sandy plains, where there was no water fit to drink, he rested for 8 days in the city of Lab, a place now in ruins, while he prepared to cross the desert lying to the east, so great a desert, he says, that it would require a year to traverse its whole length, a haunted wilderness, where drums and other instruments are heard, though invisible. After spending a year crossing this desert, Marco Polo reached Ticha-Tichiu in the province of Tangout, a town built on the western limits of the Chinese Empire. There are but few merchants here, the greater part of the population being agricultural. The custom that seems to have struck him the most in the province of Tangout was that of burning their dead only on a day fixed by the astrologers. All the time that the dead remain in their houses, the relations stay there with them, preparing a place at each meal as well as providing both food and drink for the corpse, as though it were still alive. Marco Polo and his companions made an excursion to the northeast, to the city of Amil, going on as far as Jinchinthalas, a town inhabited by idolaters, Mahometans, and Nestorian Christians, whose situation is disputed. From this town, Marco Polo returned to Ticha and went eastward across Tangout, by the town of Sosiu, over a tract of country particularly favorable to the cultivation of rhubarb, and by Kanpaisan, the Khan Tichiu of the Chinese, then the capital of the province of Tangout, an important town, whose numerous chiefs are idolaters and polygamists. The three Venetians remained a year in this large city. It is easy to understand, from their long halts and deviations, why they required 3 years for their journey across Central Asia. They left Khan Tichiu, and after riding for 12 days, they reached the borders of a sandy desert and entered the city of Etsana. This was another detour, as it lay directly north of their route, but they wished to visit Karakoram, the celebrated capital of Tartary, where Rubruquis had been in 1254. Marco Polo was certainly an explorer by nature. Fatigue was nothing to him if he had any geographical studies to complete, which is proved by his spending 40 days crossing an uninhabited desert without vegetation in order to reach the Tartar town. When he arrived there, he found a city measuring 3 miles in circumference, which had been for a long time the capital of the empire, before it was conquered by Genghis Khan, the grandfather of the reigning emperor. Here Marco Polo makes an historical digression, in which he gives an account of the wars of the Tartar chiefs against the famous Prester John, who held all this part of the country under his dominion. Marco Polo, after returning to Khan Tichiu, left it again, marching 5 days towards the east and arriving at the town of Urginal. Thence he went a little to the south to visit Siningfu, across a tract of country where grazed great wild oxen and the valuable species of goat, which is called the musk-bearer. Returning to Urginal, they went eastward to Cialis, where there is the best manufactory of cloth made from camel's hair in the world, to Tenduk, a town in the province of the same name, where a descendant of Prester John reigned, but who had given in his submission to the great Khan. This was a busy, flourishing town. From hence the travelers went to Sindatichu, and on beyond the Great Wall of China as far as Sayagana, which must be Tizin Balgasa, a pretty town where the emperor lives when he wishes to hawk, for cranes, storks, pheasants, and partridges abound in this neighborhood. At last Marco Polo, his father and his uncle, reached Sayandu or Tichan Tichu of the present day, called elsewhere in this narrative Clemenfu. Here Kublai Khan received the papal envoys, for he was occupying his summer palace beyond the Great Wall, north of Pekin, which was then the capital of the empire. The traveler does not tell us what reception he met with, but he describes most carefully the palace, the grandeur of the building of stone and marble, standing in the middle of a park surrounded by walls, enclosing menageries and fountains. Also a building made of reeds, so closely interlaced as to be impenetrable to water. It was a sort of movable kiosk that the great Khan inhabited during the fine months of June, July, and August. The weather during the emperor's sojourn in this summer palace could not but be beautiful, for according to Marco Polo, the astrologers who were attached to the Khan's court were charged to scatter all rain and fog by their sorcery, and the travelers seemed to believe in the power of these magicians. These astrologers, he says, belong to 2 races, both idolaters. They are learned in all magic and enchantments above any other men, and what they do is done by the aid of the devil, but they make others believe that they owe their power to the help of God and their own holiness. These people have the following strange custom. When a man has been condemned and put to death, they take the body, cook, and eat it, but in the case of a natural death, they do not eat the body. And you must know that these people of whom I am speaking, who know so many kinds of enchantments, work the wonder I am about to relate. When the great Khan is seated at dinner in the principal dining hall, the table of which is 8 cubits in length, and the cups are on the floor 10 paces from the table, filled with wine, milk, and other good beverages, these clever magicians, by their arts make these cups rise by themselves, and without anyone touching them, they are placed before the great Khan. This has been done before an immense number of people, and is the exact truth, and those skilled in necromancy will tell you that it is quite possible to do this. Marco Polo next gives a history of Kublai, whom he considers to possess more lands and treasures than any man since our first father Adam. He tells how the great Khan ascended the throne in the year 1256, being then 85. He was a man of middle height, rather stout, but of a fine figure, with a good complexion and black eyes. He was a good commander in war, and his talents were put to the proof when his uncle Nayan, having rebelled against him, wished to dispute his power at the head of 400,000 cavalry. Kublai Khan collected, in secret, a force of 300,000 horsemen and 0-foot soldiers and marched against his uncle. The battle was a most terrible one, so many men being killed, but the Khan was victorious, and Nayan, as a prince of the blood royal, was condemned to be sewn up tightly in a carpet and died in great suffering. After his victory, the Khan made a triumphal entry into Cathay, capital of Cambaluc, or as it is now called, Pekin. When Marco Polo arrived at this city, he made a long stay there, remaining until the emperor needed his services to undertake various missions into the interior of China. The emperor had a splendid palace at Cambaluc, and the traveler gives so graphic an account of the riches and magnificence of the Mongol sovereigns that we give it word for word. The palace is surrounded by a great wall, a mile long each way, 4 miles in length altogether, very thick, 10 feet in height, all white and battlemented. At each corner of this wall is a palace beautiful and rich, in which all the trappings of war belonging to the great Khan are kept. His bows, quivers, the saddles and bridles of the horses, the bowstrings, in fact everything that would be wanted in time of war. In the midst of each square is another building, like those at the corner, so that there are 8 in all, and each building contains one particular kind of harness or trapping. In the wall on the south side are 5 doors, the middle or large door only being opened when the emperor wishes to go in or out. Near this great gate on either side is a smaller one through which other people may pass, and 2 others for the same purpose. Inside this wall is another, having also 8 buildings to be used in the same manner. Plan of Pekin. Plan of Pekin. Thus we see that all these buildings constituted the emperor's armory and harness store. We shall not be surprised that there was so much harness to be kept, when we know that the emperor possessed a race of horses white as snow, and among them 10,000 mares, whose milk was reserved for the sole use of princes of the blood royal. The Emperor's Palace at Pekin. The Emperor's Palace at Pekin. Marco Polo continues his narrative thus: the inner wall has 5 gates on the south side, answering to those in the outer wall, but on the other sides the walls have only 1 gate each. In the center of the enclosure made by these walls stands the palace, the largest in the world. It has no second story, but the ground floor is raised about 8 feet above the ground. The roof is very high. The walls of the rooms are covered with gold and silver, and on this gold and silver are paintings of dragons, birds, horses, and other animals, so that nothing can be seen but gilding and pictures. The dining hall is large enough to hold men, and the number of other rooms is marvelous, and all is so well arranged that it could not be improved. The ceilings are painted vermilion, green, blue, yellow, and all kinds of colors, varnished so as to shine like crystal, and the roof is so well built that it will last for many years. Between the 2 walls, the land is laid out in fields with fine trees in them, containing different species of animals, the muskox, white deer, roebuck, fallow deer, and other animals, who fill the space between the walls, except the roads reserved for human beings. On the northwestern side is a great lake, full of fishes of divers kinds, for the great Khan has had several species placed there, and each time that he desires it to be done, he has his will in it. A river rises in this lake and flows out from the grounds of the palace, but no fish escape in it, there being iron and brass nets to prevent their doing so. On the northern side, near an arched doorway, the emperor has had a mound made, 100 feet in height and more than a mile in circumference. It is covered with evergreen trees, and the emperor, being very fond of horticulture, whenever he hears of a fine tree, sends for it and has it brought by his elephants, with the roots and surrounding soil, the size of the tree being no impediment, and thus he has the finest collection of trees in the world. The hill is called Green Hill, from its being covered with evergreen trees and green turf, and on the top of the hill is a house. This hill is altogether so beautiful that it is the admiration of every one. After Marco Polo has concluded his description of this palace, he gives one of that of the emperor's son and heir. Then he speaks of the town of Cambaluc, the old town which is separated from the modern town of Taidu by a canal, the same which divides the Chinese and Tartar quarters of Pekin. The traveler gives many particulars of the emperor's habits, and among other things, he says that Kublai Khan has a bodyguard of 2,000 horse soldiers, but he adds, it is not fear that causes him to keep this guard. His meals are real ceremonies, and etiquette is most rigidly enforced. His table is raised above the others, and he always sits on the north side with his principal wife on his right, and lower down his sons, nephews, and relations. He is waited upon by noble barons, who are careful to envelope their mouths and noses in fine cloth of gold, so that their breath and their odor may not contaminate the food or drink of their lord. When the emperor is about to drink, a band of music plays, and when he takes the cup in his hand, all the barons and everyone present fall on their knees. The principal fêtes given by the Grand Khan were on the anniversary of his birth, and on the first day of the year. At the first, 12,000 barons were accustomed to assemble round the throne, and to them were presented annually 150,000 garments made of gold and silk and ornamented with pearls, whilst the subjects, idolaters as well as Christians, offered up public prayers. At the second of these fêtes, on the first day of the year, the whole population, men and women alike, appeared dressed in white, following the tradition that white brings good fortune, and everyone brought gifts to the king of great value. 100,000 richly caparisoned horses, 5,000 elephants covered with handsome cloths and carrying the imperial plate, as well as a large number of camels, passed in procession before the emperor.